Hello, everyone. We would like to begin by acknowledging that if, like me, you are at UBC Point Grey, then the land on which we are gathered is the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territory of the Musqueam. For those of you at UBC Okanagan, you are on the unceded territory of the Silks. For people everywhere else, I'll invite you to go to nativeland.ca. You can see a link on your screen. Look up where you are, or if you already know where you are, to enter all together at the same time in a waterfall in the chat, where you are, what traditional territory you're on. You're welcome here, wherever you're coming from, and I'm glad that you've joined. This event started pretty large in the before times when we were all gathering in person, and it's really grown from there. I'll give you some background and context to what it is and what, thank you to you, it's become. At UBC, decolonization curriculum is being piloted in 8 courses in 5 different engineering departments, and many other courses are undertaking independent decolonization work in their courses. This is an indigenization complement to all of that decolonization work. Elsewhere, in their collaborations with faculty, within their academic publications and their club work, students are undertaking cutting-edge work in decolonization and indigenization. Knowing that I'm missing many people doing good work, I'll specifically highlight some names of some students doing extraordinary work. Danilo Caron, who is responsible for really all of the work and organization that has gone into this event and other important events at UBC. Debelina Saha, James Shaw, and the whole Builders Without Borders club team. This is also a good time to express my gratitude to Dean Olson and Cheryl Staub French for their support, not only monetarily, but also for being here. I think time is perhaps the most important show of support. So today, these students who are practicing decolonization in their work, in their classes, are going to be practicing the skill of first listening, then facilitating dialogue. Both of these skills are all about holding space for and empowering others' voices. Tonight, all of you joining here will be doing both. You'll be adding your voice to the story of what design and reconciliation are. My hope for today is that you leave inspired and empowered by our extraordinary speakers to be able to include Indigenous design principles in your definition of design work. You're welcome here, and I'm so glad that you've joined us. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to Cheryl Staub French.
Well, thank you, Pam. Before you hand over, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit more and say more about who you are and your role here at UBC? You're up, yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Pam Wolf, and I'm an assistant professor of teaching in civil and environmental engineering. I specifically focus on teaching engineering, communication, and design. And much of my educational leadership work is around the decolonization of our curriculum, learning, and activities across the engineering department.
Great, thank you. I also just want to start by acknowledging the amazing work of Pam and Danilo. This is really Pam's vision come to life, and Danilo has really done a tremendous job in organizing these events and bringing together these amazing speakers. So I just want to extend a tremendous thank you to both of them for their leadership. I also want to thank the facilitators. They're sort of the unsung heroes of this event. They've spent a lot of time learning about facilitation and engaging with Danilo and Pam about the organization of these events. We're also incredibly fortunate to have such amazing guest speakers here today. There's also others behind the scenes. You know, I want to acknowledge Flint and others who have, you know, Sarah Akhtar, who have been behind the scenes helping us to kind of organize all the different logistical aspects of this. I wanted to end by sort of setting up the plan for the day. So we've already had Pamela go through the first 2 parts For the plan for the day, the next step is you'll hear from Dean Olson about applied sciences vision around events like these. We're going to hear from the speakers following that. And then from there, we're going to engage in the dialogues. So there'll be a few different parts of the program before we're actually engaging in the dialogues. So with that, again, welcome to everyone. We're so glad that you could all make it tonight. I know this time is hard for many people, and for those speakers or who are coming from across Canada, we are so grateful that you're spending your evenings with us. And with that, I'll hand it over to Danilo to do the formal speaker invitation.
Thanks, Cheryl. First speaker tonight is going to be Randy Herrmann. Randy is the director of the Engineering Access Program, NGAP, at University of Manitoba. NGAP is a support program designed to assist First Nations, Métis and Inuit students seeking an engineering degree. Over the years, Randy's work with Canadian Indigenous communities and within the engineering field demonstrated a lack of Indigenous engineers, and it is his dedication to changing this that has led NGAP to become the envy of universities across Canada. He is a fellow of Engineers Canada, a member of the Canadian Academy of Engineering, a member of the Engineers Geoscientists Manitoba, and the Manitoba Métis community. I would like you, I'd like to just, Cheryl, did you say that Dean Olson was going to speak?
Yes, I apologize to my dean for overlooking that important part. So maybe we could pause the introductions and have James say a few words. I'm so sorry, James.
Absolutely no problem, Cheryl. I feel bad that I'm now in between or just ahead, or I guess preventing us from having our speaker here. But I guess I'll be very brief. I just want to say good evening to everybody and to welcome you to today's dialogue and to really just thank everyone for joining. And I'd also just like to thank our many facilitators, our faculty, our staff, and our students for their active engagement and support of this event. And a very special thank you, of course, to our guest speakers for their time and support and for sharing their knowledge and experience to help us as a faculty become better. And I'll talk to you a little bit about why that is so important to us. But really being better at understanding Indigenous ways of knowing and our role in reconciliation. And especially Randy Herrmann, who we almost got through his entire introduction biography. I did want to just spend just a minute talking about our strategic plan. As many of you know, we as a faculty have just completed our strategic plan that we call Transforming Tomorrow. Within that plan, and I encourage everyone to take a look at it, and it's of course online, and it's meant to be viewed on the internet. But at the heart, if you go through that plan, there are really, the heart of that plan are the 6 priorities that we've identified for ourselves. These are the things that we really care the most about. And 3 of them are focused on transforming the world, the impact it will make on the world across the scales of people, place, and planet. The remaining 3 are really focused on transforming ourselves. And it's in recognition that in order to meet our ambitions for meaningful and lasting impact on the world, we need to also transform ourselves. And so 3 priorities external, 3 priorities are really internal. Of the 3 that are internal, the one is we call inclusive leadership and respect, is the priority of inclusive leadership and respectful engagement, and especially our commitment to Indigenous human rights and our responsibilities to respond to truth and reconciliation. Some of the strategies that we've developed as part of that priority are facilitating open dialogue about truth, reconciliation, and the recognition of Indigenous peoples' human rights which is one of the reasons why tonight's event is so important. It's also around indigenizing our curriculum, including Indigenous ways of knowing, culture, histories, experiences, worldviews, in curriculum delivered across our faculty's programs and, of course, both of our campuses. And we're also enhancing opportunities for Indigenous kids and youth to engage with STEM education through land-based learning within their communities through our Gearing Up, our In-STEM Indigenous Outreach program. I know that all of our professions, the reasons we do that is that all of our professions within applied science, even beyond engineering, we're all problem solvers, we're designers, we're solution providers. We benefit from a diversity of perspectives, which include a diversity of thoughts and a diversity of experiences. And I appreciate that incorporating Indigenous design principles will enhance our ability to harness the opportunities of Indigenous knowledge and pedagogy in solving some of the biggest challenges we have in society today. And so I think on that note, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank everyone again for joining, and just to say that I'm very much looking forward to tonight's dialogue. Thank you. So Danilo, please continue.
Hey, I guess I should just introduce myself. I'm Danilo. I'm a master's student. I'm a member of the Sagamok Anishinaabe First Nation, and it's just my pleasure to work with amazing people and to be a part of the UBC community. Without any more delay, I would invite you to welcome and join me welcoming Randy.
All right, thank you very much, everybody. And I'm trusting everyone can see my presentation. If not, please, someone scream out at me and let me know. I'd like to start with a territorial acknowledgement. The University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji-Cree, the Dakota, and the Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the many treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. I hope this presentation does that in some small way. And of course, it didn't. Why didn't it go forward? Let's try this. Okay, there we go. So just in case you don't know, because you're quite far away from here, this big blue arrow is kind of showing where we are, and it's there's an indication of all the different treaties that were made across the western provinces here. And the only thing I'd like to highlight here is that keep in mind that the treaties do not follow the provincial boundaries, right? The provincial boundaries are artificial. The treaties are where these people used to live. So I'd like to, this presentation is a small nucleus of a larger presentation I give, and it's changed tremendously from that. So I'm going to apologize. I'm going to try to get it done in 30 minutes. I think I should be able to, but I'm not 100% sure because I haven't actually given this presentation before. And I switched it up to talk about traditional Indigenous design. The other apology I want to make is this is my understanding of traditional Indigenous design. This does not reflect Indigenous design as it might be today, nor does it reflect all Indigenous people in Canada or North America or the world. So keep in mind that this is my interpretation. If you asked 100 Indigenous people, you might come up with 99 different answers of what is traditional Indigenous design. So keep that in mind. I don't want to be blamed for anything later. That's my cover my ass bit. So I think Danilo did a very, very good job of introducing me, so we'll skip by this. And I'm going to start with a couple of different definitions that I cribbed literally off the internet, probably off of Wikipedia. And let's start thinking about this. Let's start thinking about what do we mean by design? Sort of a plan for the construction of an object or a system. What is engineering? Well, engineering is that branch of science and technology that's concerned with the design, building, and use of engines, machines, and structures. Now, certainly prior to colonization, certainly we're not talking about engines, but we are talking about simple machines and structures. And then we have science, the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. In my larger presentation, I make I highlight the fact that this was occurring prior to colonization, that what the indigenous people were doing was definitely science. I've shortened that, so hopefully that still will come through. And then technology is putting it all together to invent useful tools or to solve any problems. And again, indigenous people prior to colonization were definitely doing this. If we look at this sort of simple breakdown, we can look at Western science on the left-hand side and sort of indigenous science on the right-hand side. And if you look long enough, you can realize that they're almost diametrically opposed to each other, right? And our engineering curriculum, our engineering degrees, our engineering fields are quite heavily based on the left-hand side, right? And we need to move that. We need to move that idea into the right-hand side. And not only are they heavily based, not only is science heavily based, but also our understanding of engineering design, right? And in our engineering culture in North America, and even in Europe to quite an extent, is primarily expressed as domineering or conquering nature. And that's expressed in almost everything we do. And when I was going through school, the big line was ERTW, engineers rule the world. What is that implying to everybody? That's implying that we are. If there was a God and then there's us. And we need to move away from that sort of aspect a lot. We need to move more towards the indigenous science aspect, where they're, in my mind, they are living within nature. They're not trying to commandeer nature. They're not trying to overrule nature. They're living within nature. I've taken this from Paul Feyerabend, who's a philosopher of science, and he comes up with these kind of ideas. And you could, wherever you see science, you could actually, kind of replace design in here as well, right? First world or Western science is one science among many. By claiming to be more, it ceases to be an instrument of research and turns into a political pressure group. And science is only one of the many instruments people invented to cope with their surroundings. It's not the only one, it's not infallible, and has become too powerful, too pushy, and too dangerous to be left on its own. And I think we see that in many things that are occurring in the world today. I'm going to limit my view of things to three different sort of topics to show you sort of some of what I consider, indigenous design and how it looks and how it could look sort of in the engineering realm. And I'm going to talk about transportation, housing, and food production. So when we think about transportation, I'm going to start thinking about traditional indigenous type transportation, the travois, the sleigh, snowshoes, and of course maybe the stereotype or the prototype that we often think about is the canoe. And at the end of the presentation, I want to give some examples, and hopefully I'll get there, but like I said, I can sometimes talk too much, so I'll try to limit it. But I'm looking at these pictures of these canoes, and around the turn of the century, just after the 1900s, actually an engineer who was working with the Canadian military took time to document some of the traditional crafts that were being constructed by indigenous groups before that art died out. And it's really a wonderful book, and I have the reference at the end of my presentation. But I want you to look at all these different canoes and look at the variability and understand that some of this variability was indeed dependent upon culture, but some of this variability was dependent on how the canoe was being used, whether the canoe was ocean bearing or whether the canoe was being used in a lake or a fast moving river. And some of it was also based on how the canoe was being used. Was it being used to transport goods? Was it being used to hunt out of? Was it being used to get from point A to point B? And you can see the variability of design, right? You look at all the different designs of these canoes. And in your area, or at least in BC, not outside of the coast, they were using what they called the sturgeon nose canoe. These are pictures of modern day canoes, and I looked this up once, and I can't remember, but there's been 200 plus patents on the canoe since the time of colonization. And none of the patents actually changed the design of the canoe per se, didn't change the geometry of the canoe. All the patents deal with the material of the canoe, right? So the design is simple. The design is almost perfect. And what they've done is they've changed the materials. And in some way, they've changed the materials for the worst. The traditional materials, which was wood or birch bark, when you were done with the canoe, you left it, and then in a year or two, the canoe would be completely gone. I'm a fisherman. I enjoy fishing in sort of far out, weird places that it takes, time to get to. And in that time, I was fishing in sort of the north part of southern Ontario, and I came across a fiberglass canoe which had a hole in it. I suppose somebody abandoned it. And for 10 years, that fiberglass canoe was there. And for 10 years, that fiberglass canoe had not degraded at all. And likely if I go back 10 years from now, that fiberglass canoe will still be there, and that fiberglass canoe will not have degraded at all. It'll be the same canoe it was 10 years ago with a hole in it. Likewise, if we look at snowshoes, the same thing is happening with snowshoes. You look at their shape. Some of their shape is dependent on culture, but most of it is dependent on the type of snow they are encountering, as well as the depth of that snow. So you have all these wonderful different designs that were being used for snowshoes. And in your area, you had sort of near your area, you had sort of this interior sailish design of a snowshoe. And again, modern day hasn't really changed the design. They've changed some of the materials, but they really haven't changed the design. And I want to take a minute and look at housing, because housing across your area, the West Coast, is incredible. And I look at some of these housings and I'm seeing housing that might have occurred in any number of subdivisions, modern day subdivisions. And what I find interesting is how they actually harvested some of the planks for the trees they used. And again, I want to use this as an example to show you the difference between the ideas of what the Western colonizers would have done versus what the indigenous people would have done. Western colonizers would have come in with a sawmill, they would have chopped every tree down, and they would have milled lumber out of every tree, and they would have used that, they would have shipped it far and wide in order for people to make houses out of it. The indigenous culture did what they called planking trees. And apparently, I haven't seen one, but apparently there are still living planked trees. Trees that have been planked hundreds of years ago that have lived. By planking a tree in this way, you can ensure its survival. And you can get many planks out of one tree. So that's what they were doing. Again, I want to use that as the difference between sort of what what a Western culture would have done versus what an indigenous culture would have done. And in the interior of BC, they would have used what they called, these quiglies, or these hole houses that were built into the ground. And think about the importance of this in terms of heat retention. As engineers, we understand that, right? This is probably the most not only environmentally conscious, but the best house sort of for heat retention and everything else. A design that was used much later by colonists when they came here to Manitoba in developing a sod house. This is basically what we would have called a sod house. There's an actual picture of one, in the early days. So I want to break away, and I want to talk quickly about Douglas Cardinal. And I don't know if you know who Douglas Cardinal is, but he's quite a famous architect. He has many buildings under his name. One of the most famous is probably the Museum of Civilization in Ottawa. He was the architect of design on that museum. He is a man of Blackfoot heritage on his father's side and Métis Scottish heritage on his mother's side. And he was breaking into architecture probably in about the mid-1960s. And at that time, universities and the working world in terms of STEM careers was not a very receptive place for people of Indigenous heritage. This was his first building, and it's a church in Red Deer, Alberta. And this is actually a quote from a report I read about this church, and you can still get it online today. And it's called The Structural Audacity of St. Mary's Church. And the whole point about this church is that he designed this church on paper. He designed it with, the people who were running the church, and they came up with the design, as most architects do. And then he went with his design, and he went to an engineer, a structural engineer, to get it built. And the roof of this church, if you can see here, here's a plan showing what he wants. And it not only is it circular, think the next picture will show you. Not only it's circular, it's at this angle. This church is at this angle. So he went to design this church. And he wanted to make it out of concrete. But unfortunately, he didn't have the budget to build it out of formed concrete. So he wanted some other method. And at that point, the structural engineer he worked with said it can't be done. It can't be done. You got to go back to your committee, and you have to talk to the committee and tell them that you got to go with a different design. Meanwhile, he had spent a considerable amount of time and effort to convince the committee he was working with that this was the church they wanted, and they really enjoyed this look and everything else. So it would have been really bad for him to go back to his group and say that can't be done because the structural engineer said so. So instead of doing that, he thought back about what he had learned from his Indigenous grandparents. And they had often told him, you know, when things are uncertain, when times get tough, it often helps to go and look into nature, to take a walk and to get back in touch with your roots. So that's what he did. And he was walking, and then he was walking through a field, and he saw a spider web. And he looked at that spider web and he thought to himself, well, that spider web, it spans vast distances. And that spider web has a lot of force on it. I see the wind blowing it. And that spider web is not breaking. So he thought to himself, I'm going to go back and I'm going to talk to my structural engineer again. So he went back to his structural engineer and he talked about the spider web. And he said, you know what, is there a way that we can do this using that sort of analogy? And actually, as you can see, this building was built. It was that analogy of the spider web that helped the structural engineer design this building. The other thing I want you to note about this building is that you can see the nature coming out of this building, sort of the natural curves, the fit it has in sort of the environment. As engineers, and I know I fall into this category, as engineers, we are trained to think about this. As a structural engineer, this is what you want to see. You want to see everything at right angles, right? You don't want to see this. This is a cross-section of his church and how he wanted to build it. And you can see the concrete envelope here that he wanted to build. This is not what you want to see, obviously, as a structural engineer, because you'll tell your client, no, you can't build it. When in actuality, you can. And using the spider web analogy, he was able to get this built. And there's an actual picture of the inside of the church today. So what could have turned into being the biggest blunder of his life, had he listened to conventional thinking, turned into probably one of his signature pieces because he listened to his Indigenous roots. And hopefully, as I go through this presentation, that sort of thinking will come through. I want to talk about food production. And when the European colonizers first came to this country, they believed that agriculture as it wasn't happening. And it most definitely was happening. Agriculture as Europeans would have noticed it wasn't happening, but agriculture was happening. One of the things that was happening was companion planting. And this method of planting was responsible for civilizations. We're not talking 100, 200 people. We're talking tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people living in cities at the time prior to colonization. And companion planting in our community, we call this the 3 sisters. I've heard different people calling it the 7 sisters because you can grow 7 different things. And what we do here is we actually grow the same crop in the same little plot of soil. 3 different crops here: corn, squash, and beans. And you might ask, well, why are we growing corn, squash, and beans in one little plot? I don't know how many corn farmers there are on the West Coast, but I know there's lots here in Manitoba. And what you realize is if you're growing corn in a traditional European way, you could probably grow corn for 1 season, maybe 2 seasons. And then after that, the nitrogen is so depleted from the soil that it cannot grow corn again, except with heavy applications of fertilizer. So Indigenous people, probably around between 5,000 and 7,000 years ago, knew this. So what did they do? Well, they planted beans. Why do they plant beans? Well, because beans take nitrogen out of the air and fix it into the ground through their roots. So what the beans do the corn needs. The corn needs the nitrogen, they get it from the beans, right? This didn't happen by accident. This happened by experimentation. Not only that, the beans will use the corn for scaffolding and grow really high. So the question becomes, well, why are you growing squash in there? Well, the squash doesn't add a chemical into the process. What the squash does, the squash actually acts like not only a pesticide, but also a barrier against predators. The biggest predator that loves corn here is the raccoon. The raccoon won't go through a squash plant to get the corn. If you've ever been with squash, you know the leaves are kind of sticky. It kind of got little spikes on it. The raccoons hate it. So this protects it. Not only that, the leafy canopy of the squash protects the ground from drying out. Quite literally, Indigenous people could plant this crop and go away. They could go hunting, they could go fishing, they could come back a month from now or 2 months from now and harvest this crop. You didn't have to be like a European farmer that had to wait right next to the crop and scare off all kinds of animals and water it all the time. That wasn't required. So when the Europeans came here, they thought this was happening accidentally. They didn't see that this was the farming method that was being used. You know, this also might be called polyculture. And if you look, here's some examples of companion planting. Now, the one on the right is actually in a field, so you can clearly see it's planting. But the one on the left, and the one I'm going to show you, you know, even to my eyes, this doesn't look like planting. This looks like some wild bush that you come across. But it was planting. It was nonetheless farming. This was how the Indigenous people understood farming. It wasn't about domineering the land. It wasn't about telling the land, this is what we're growing here now. It was about reading what the land wanted to grow there and making that land better able to grow those crops. And here's what we're seeing as Europeans. And I have to tell you, as you know, as someone who's probably has low-grade OCD, I love this look, right? This is so great. Everything is straight, everything is organized. I look at this and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, how would you live? If that was my garden, I don't know if I could have a garden like that. But just because I couldn't have a garden like that, it doesn't mean that it wasn't a garden. The other idea of Indigenous people was this idea of sort of polyculture. The Indigenous people invented or created, let's say, 5,000 varieties of potatoes. Local farmers in the Andean mountains still grow up to 20 different varieties in their little gardens. And they grow so many varieties so that if there's a drought, one of the potatoes will do well, or a couple of varieties will do well. If it's a lot of rain, another variety will do well. So no matter what, they're covered. There's an article written about how the potato changed the world. And if you ever have an opportunity, you should read this, because the potato really changed the world. And the potato changed the world pretty much through the Irish potato famine and other famines that occurred in Europe at that time. And why did that happen? Because for thousands of years, the potatoes were growing in North and South America, and they didn't have that problem. Well, unfortunately, during colonization, only one potato plant made it back to Ireland and to Europe. Basically, every plant that was grown in Europe was basically an identical twin of that one plant that made it, was a clone of that one plant that made it. And this made it very, very susceptible to bacteria, and so, or any sort of disease. So when the disease came, it pretty much ran rampant through all of the potato farms in all of Europe, killing off huge amounts of potatoes and therefore causing a starvation, right? So that's a negative example. They took something that the Incans in the Andean mountains were using quite successfully for thousands of years to feed their people. The Europeans took it, they turned it into a monoculture of one single genotype, and it worked for a couple of years. It might have worked for 100 years, but eventually that crashed. And we still haven't learned our lesson, because we are still doing that today. And if you have any doubt, check up what's happening with the banana plantations in many parts of the world. So the Indigenous people were not only sort of creating, we're looking at this sort of companion planting and polyculture, they were also designing landscapes. They were designing landscapes to use for themselves. And again, if you were a European and you're coming here and you're used to those monoculture, you wouldn't have understood this, right? They were taking plants and they were transplanting them to areas where they grew better. They cared for their wild plant species until they became domesticated. They were using polyculture. They used fire to burn away unwanted land, but they generally kept it very natural looking. They weren't trying to dominate nature. And on the west coast, here's one of the bulbs that they used, and they use this quite extensively as a food crop. And I like this quote that comes from one of the researchers of this, and that the Indigenous people were active managers who promoted and valued plant resources, and thus have much more in common with farmers than previously supposed. Even today, when I read up about the people of the coast, and we call them hunters and gatherers, and we do that in order to demean what they were doing. We do that so we don't have to accept the fact that they weren't hunters and gatherers. They were active domesticators. They were active farmers, right? But European culture does not want to put word to that. Not only were they designing landscapes, they were designing seascapes. We have clam gardens in BC over 3,500 years old. We have evidence that they were actually increasing the edible rhizome zone in the tidal pools by building it up with rocks. Oh, sorry, I want to go back one. Let's talk about domestication. Again, we call wild animals, we call them wild in order to not accept the fact that they were likely these animals were likely domesticated. So a sustained multi-generational relationship in which one group of organisms assumes a significant degree of influence over the reproduction and care of another group. We all understand the turkey is domesticated. Was the bison domesticated? I could make a clear argument that it was. The caribou, was that domesticated in North America? We have no problem with saying the Laplanders in the Scandinavian countries in the north domesticated the reindeer. But we won't say that happened in Canada. In Canada, we're hunters and gatherers following the reindeer, not domesticators of the reindeer. I would also make the argument that the salmon that we called wild salmon on the West Coast were domesticated, were a domesticated animal. And why would I make that argument? We know from the archaeological records that the Indigenous people of the West Coast and the interior West Coast have been using salmon sustainably for over 4,000 years. We know they've been using salmon for over 7,500, but the archaeological record only tells us the sustainability over the last 4,000, 4,500 years. Indigenous people weren't interested in domesticating an animal like the Europeans that came later. Europeans see domestication as the complete domination and taming of wild animals and of land, to the point that personal ownership of the animal or land has to be the logical end result, right? This results in European farmers having to completely care for their animals, reproduction, constant feeding, protection against predation, all of those things. Indigenous people would not have thought of that, right? They would have put in sustainable resource management plan. And they would have done this through their rituals, through their beliefs, and through their institutions. And through that, they would have had this relationship with the salmon. They would have made sure the habitat was clear. They would have made sure that things wouldn't have changed despite the fact that they were taking salmon out of the system. They would have done that by taking only the salmon who weren't as strong or as fast or as likely to breed. To me, that's domestication. Not only that, they were taking salmon in an industrial way. They were harvesting these salmon, they were keeping them for overwinter, they were smoking these salmons, they were air drying these salmons, and not only that, they had this really large trade network of salmon to other groups around the area. The Indigenous people would have thought no more about owning a wild animal than they would have thought about owning a star or the sun or even land. That wasn't the way they saw the world. But just because they didn't do things the way Europeans did things, it doesn't mean it wasn't happening. Here's some of the things that they introduced, some of the inventions they came up with in order to have this fish farming that they were doing. This is all technology. This is all engineering. This is all design. Those are weirs. That's a stone weir, and before that, that's a wooden weir that they were using to capture the salmon. Here are the drying racks they would have had. One is being dried, air dried, the other is being smoked. This is a smokehouse here on the left. And you can see the quantities of salmon that they've taken. You know, another good example of sort of Indigenous design is if I was asked as an engineer to design a bat, this is a bat that you would use to whack a fish on the head to kill it when you brought it into your boat, right? This is a bat I would design. Most engineers would design a bat like this, right? This is the way the Indigenous people would have seen this design of a bat. And I'm hoping that we can all see the difference, right? Not only were they interested in the harvest of the sustainable harvest of the salmon, wrapped up in all of that was this idea of community, that everyone should have equal access to the resource, and if they don't, they should get equal access to the proceeds of that resource, which would be equal access to the dried salmon and everything else. So if I had to boil it down to what I thought traditional Indigenous design looked like, and again, this is my thoughts: sustainability, incorporation into natural landscape, work within nature, not against nature, typically environmentally friendly, using naturally locally sourced materials, a general ease of construction and or repair, long life cycle, community driven, and thinking about a generational timeline. Not what gets us money today, what gets our children and grandchildren a better future. The other thing I didn't put on here that I would put is that sort of the non-commodification of things. Whereas in European culture, everything is commodified. Every single thing we have is commodified. That's not the way they saw things. And here's some of the examples I want to use quickly. I got a few here. Is that, you know, people always ask me, well, you know what, why didn't the Indigenous people in North America, why didn't they build roadways? You know, they could have built roadways. Building a roadway is not high science. You put a couple of stones down, you got a roadway. The Indigenous people were easily capable of building roadways. Why didn't they? Well, they didn't build roadways because virtually anywhere in Canada, you can get to any ocean by the rivers or the lakes, right? An average 16-year-old Indigenous person prior to colonization could spend 3 days in the bush, could make himself something to transport himself with, a canoe of some form, and then could take that canoe and they could go from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean to the Arctic Ocean to the Mississippi, down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. Does it take more time? Sure it does. But here's what we have, right? Water routes versus paved routes. Indigenous design versus Western design. Free, non-polluting. It's slower, yeah, but time wasn't commodified. It's sustainable. Time, local focus. It'll last forever. Western design. It's costly, it's polluting. It's faster, yes it is, but it's not really sustainable. But time is a commodity now, so you're motivated by time. And here's, I think this is my last example. I want to show you how it actually played out in my life. For many years, I was going into different communities, not just Indigenous communities, and I was talking to kids in grade 6 all the way to grade 12, and I'd say, you know, today we're going to make a bridge out of straw, right? And here's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking this bridge out of straw. I got these straws, and these straws are little beams, and I'm going to build these bridges. And I'm looking here, and I can see that I didn't set this up right. Behind there's another bridge here. Behind there's another bridge. And, you know, this is the kind of bridge I would have built. This is how I see things. I did this in Ottawa one year, and there was a group of young Cree women from northern Manitoba. And they were from an isolated community, a flying community, and they were probably about 14 or 15. Given the straws, they were very quiet. They never said a word to me, you know. And I came back every once in a while to check on them. And there they are wrecking the straws. Like literally, they're taking the straws against the edge of the table, and they're not making them circular anymore. They're unbending the straws. They look like they're tearing apart these straws and they're piling them up. And me, again, I know I have Métis background, but I wasn't raised that way. I wasn't raised on the land. I was raised in a city. I understand city. I was trained as an engineer. I look at them and and again, I'm a man, so forgive me. I start mansplaining to these young Indigenous women saying, you know, these straws, they're actually like beams. And you know, bridges are built out of beams. Likely these young women maybe had never seen a bridge from the bottom, had never paid attention if they had seen one. So they kept bending these straws, and they gave me the smile that any teenage girl gives, you know, a grumpy old man who tries to tell them something, right? They look at me.
Oh, love this.
Someone's laughing anyways, it's like something. So anyways, they look at me, and so, you know, I said, okay, I tossed it in. I said, okay, I'm not going to bother them anymore. I'm going to let them go. Time came up, you know, I whistled everyone to stop, and I started breaking these bridges. And I take a set of weights, put them on the bridges, see how much weights the bridge hold, right? I give them a piece of tape and a bunch of straws. I'll tell you what, those young ladies, this is the bridge. This isn't the bridge they built. This is a copy of the bridge they built. They took those damn straws that they broke and they wove them together. And they used tape sparingly to make their joints stronger. I did not have enough weight to break their bridge, right? Those ladies showed me more about engineering than I learned in 4 goddamn years of engineering. And they looked at that, they looked at what I gave them, and they looked at it in a completely different way than I looked at it, than anyone else has ever looked at it. I have never had that repeated. No one has ever done that before or since, right? And where does this come from? Well, they understood weaving. Weaving was part of their culture. Weaving was something they did. And I'm going to show you this. In the Incans in South America, they've been making woven bridges, or what you would call suspended bridges, suspension bridges. They've been doing this for at least 300 years before the first European built a suspension bridge. And likely the first Europeans saw this and thought, what a great idea. Let's build suspension bridges. So this is what, to me, this is the epitome of Indigenous design. And that's the end of my presentation. I think I was pretty close. I was maybe a little bit long. Here's some of my resources. So I'll turn it over to you, Jill, and you can sort of download. I'll stop. I don't know if I have to stop sharing or if they can do that for me.
So Randy, unfortunately, Jill's power went out in Winnipeg.
Are you kidding me?
Nope. So she's wondering if you would be willing to go through her slides for her, since she doesn't have hotspot. Yeah.
Sure, but I don't have her slide deck. Do you have it?
Yes, in the last couple minutes, I've scrambled and I've set up everything here.
Call it up for me. You know,
yeah,
if I had
okay.
known that, I would have talked more. I had lots of stuff I could have said.
Yeah. Well, so is that what we would like to do? And also, thank you, Randy. That was really great.
Yeah, no, this will work.
Okay. All right.
Well, I'll just give me a chance to introduce Chelsea Dubiel. She's a recent grad from the University of Manitoba Biosystems Engineering program with an environmental specialization. Her dedication to building safer spaces in communities she's a part of can be seen through the development of the University of Manitoba Engineering Society Equity Committee and the WOMEN student groups, as well as her involvement as a student athlete with the Bisons. I invite you to welcome Chelsea with me. Is Reed going to join us later?
So is Reed, I also don't know if Reed's power went out.
I've still got power.
Okay, great.
So,
Okay, tell you what, I'll introduce you right now, Reed. That way
Sounds
you can
good.
pop in when it's appropriate. Reed is a Métis student from Winnipeg, working on his Master of Science in Biosystems Engineering at the University of Manitoba, with a focus on the area of engineering education. His research has explored the incorporation of Indigenous ways of knowing into the engineering design process and in engineering education. Let's welcome all our University of Manitoba folks.
Okay, Chelsea, I guess just go to the next one because I don't think I can forward it, can I? No. So Jill and I have been working on several different projects within the faculty to sort of bring Indigenous technology and engineering into the engineering faculty. Next one, Chelsea. And I think this is mostly going to be just reading of these slides. We have done some workshops with engineering professors to try to get them to, and we work with our Indigenous community on campus, as well as with our Center of Advanced Teaching and Learning. And the engineering faculty now, we have an elder on campus. That's the fellow on the bottom right. His name is Norm Mead. And these are also two other Indigenous women that have worked with us from the Center of Advancement in Teaching and Learning. And looking at sort of this holistic model of an engineer and of teaching, of an engineer in particular, and teaching in general. And trying to get through to some of the engineers, looking at how they introduce themselves and how they bring themselves out in the classroom as being important to not just Indigenous learners, but to all learners, to try to sort of break down those barriers. Next. So this is one of the things we worked on is that idea of positionality with our engineering professors. And I tell this story that, you know, when I was in school, I actually had a professor, a university professor in engineering, who actually never turned around and said anything to the class for the whole term. He just was looking one way and writing on the blackboard continually, every class for the whole term, and never turned around. And really, it was the reason I didn't go into civil engineering, because it was just a terrible experience for me coming out of high school. And sort of that understanding that, you know what, bringing a piece of who you are into the classroom is going to be an acceptable process. If you ever work with Indigenous people, sometimes the first thing that you do is find out your connection to somebody else. You know, who are you related to? Where are you coming from? And this is this idea of speaking to our positionality. So next one. And as we were going through this process, we started off with small steps. And one of the first things we did, we have an Indigenous scholar in architecture and engineering. He's a trained architect. And he introduced a course, the Shoal Lake 40 First Nations course, working with Shoal Lake First Nation, and Chelsea's going to talk about that more. So it was really a wonderful experience. I'm not going to talk too much about that. Then we got Elder Mead and Leah Marshall and Carl Stone, Leah Fontaine, all these people on board to sort of help us with the idea that you can't do it alone. You need to have that, you know, you need to have that help from the Indigenous community, local in community, and you know, to do these things, right? And we're working our way across sort of getting larger and larger groups here. Diane is a national group, and so is the engineering educators. Next one. Again, in the year, some of the people we worked with sort of at the U of M, we had the Indigenous Student Center involved. We had the Department of, used to be Native Studies. They are in the process of changing their name to the Department of Indigenous Studies. We had an NGAP student, Lyndon Travers, and we had the Center for Advancement of Teaching and Learning. We shouldn't be doing this stuff in a vacuum. Just because we're engineers doesn't mean we know the answers to everything. Next one. Although just between us, we do know the answers to everything, right? So these are just some shots of things that we were doing with the different groups within engineering. We took them. That is actually that person who's blowing on the smudge happens to be the old dean of engineering at the University of Manitoba. We went to the Truth and Reconciliation Center national headquarters, which is in Manitoba, and this group of people. This is not all this group. There was still some behind us. Were there to learn. Elder Norm Mead did a bunch of things with us, including a smudge. It was really, you know, we had very positive feedback from those professors who attended. The only downside was, in my mind, we didn't have as many professors attend as I would have liked, but small steps. Next. And again, just more pictures of the things that we're doing. We had a teaching cafe. We did a tobacco tie teaching. We did lots of different things. We had about 8 different workshops with engineering professors to sort of help them with indigenizing their curriculum, help them look at how they were teaching, if it was being done the most profitable way. Next one. At one point, we set up a national group, and we had Albert Marshall talk to us about two-eyed seeing, and he's one of our Mi'kmaq elders. And the two-eyed seeing, the whole idea, I would recommend that you would get him to talk to your staff. He is really, really wonderful. And the whole point of two-eyed seeing is looking at the world with one eye, which would be the sort of through the Western lens, and looking at the world through the other eye, which would be this sort of the Indigenous lens. And I have to say that I'd be remiss not to say that you know, his words have been influencing myself and how I'm doing my things. So very, very influential, very great speaker. Next one. Again, I mean, you can read this slide. These are some of the things that have happened as a result of the things we're doing. We've had students that have been looking at doing graduate degrees, a couple of them here today, and I don't want to take away time from them in Indigenous type engineering, looking at those kind of things. Next one. We've had some graduate work going on. We got some, these people are looking at doing graduate thesis, as I mentioned before. Keep going, next one. Next one. And I think that's bringing up Reed, right, Reed? I'll turn it over to you, sir.
All right, thanks, Randy. So, hi, everyone. I'm Reed, and I'm just going to give you a brief look at some of the research I did last year on the topic of incorporating Indigenous ways of knowing into engineering. Could you go forward like 2 slides, Chelsea? Thank you. So for some background and my motivation for my research, there's been growing interest in incorporating Indigenous knowledges and methodologies into engineering and into education more generally. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada is a pretty big driver of this. There are several points in their calls to action relating to education and the incorporation of Indigenous knowledges. There's similar interest in other countries, such as Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. And these initiatives are largely concerned with preservation of Indigenous knowledge and diversity in those spaces. But I was curious about the potential impact of indigenizing engineering education. I wondered, are there practical benefits to incorporating Indigenous knowledge? And can that knowledge be used to improve the engineering itself? And as an Indigenous engineering student, I was very intrigued by these questions and wanted to explore them. Slide, please. So I did a literature review in order to gain an understanding of both engineering and Indigenous worldviews. First, I needed to explore engineering paradigms. I wondered, how do engineers approach problems and form solutions? And then likewise, I needed to explore Indigenous values and figure out what distinguishes Indigenous values from the values that inform engineers today. Because ultimately, how these worldviews relate to one another is important to consider on the path toward their coexistence. Slide, please. So for my findings, approaches commonly associated with each worldview were researched. As you can see here, engineering. I found it to be tended to be goal-oriented. How good a solution is often judged based on predetermined criteria. Engineering is technologically focused, and they approach problems as if they're taking place within this closed system. And some of these descriptors I thought could be a little bit problematic because engineering problems are very complex. On the other hand, Indigenous approaches are more process-oriented, and they're always evolving. They lend themselves to sustainability, and there's usually substantial consideration of social and environmental factors. So all in all, these methodologies could be considered more holistic. So these two worldviews appear to be divergent, but I thought that in a sense, that kind of makes them complementary. Indigenous ways of knowing consider factors that are often absent from the engineering design process. And this means that incorporating that knowledge into engineering could better inform those processes. So then that brings up the question of how can Indigenous knowledge exist within engineering and how can it be beneficial? Slide, please. So my literature review resulted in this framework for taking a new approach to engineering design that would fit the needs of contemporary engineering problems. First of all, new design models. The foundation of practicing engineering is a model describing how to form your solution. And approaching engineering problems as if they're situated in a closed system should be rethought and expanded upon. The research process yielded multiple thoughtful models for approaching design. Slide, please. So here's an example of one. The multi-attribute learning paradigm, which was developed in response to the realization that existing engineering paradigms don't necessarily account for the complexity of engineering problems. So this tree structure was developed as a holistic outline of factors in design problems. And what distinguishes this structure from previous paradigms is the inclusion of many newly considered facets, most notably the context branch at the bottom of the figure, which includes social, political, economic, and environmental factors. Slide, please. And then next is engaging with Indigenous knowledge. So it's important to engage with Indigenous knowledges thoughtfully. Communication is already such a vital part of engineering, and making that communication more community-based and participatory could be one approach to engaging with Indigenous knowledges. Concepts present in Indigenous ways of knowing could be engaged with as sort of reference points within engineering methodologies. The medicine wheel is an example of this framework that could be applied in engineering because it's a concise visual representation of the multidimensionality of the world and also represents the many dimensions present in engineering problems. And finally, engineering education. Integrating these models and concepts into engineering education would allow engineers to develop newer perspectives. There are already examples of this underway in engineering at the University of Manitoba in some courses, like the Technology and Society course, as well as the Shoal Lake Design and Build course, which Chelsea is going to talk about in a second. And so finally, contextualizing the technical knowledge we gain as engineering students with social, environmental, and economic mindfulness is vital to our effectiveness as engineers. So that's all I've got. Thank you. And I'll hand it off to Chelsea.
Good evening. Yeah, everyone applause. Ooh, read. Good evening, everyone. First of all, my name is Chelsea, and I'd like to thank you all for giving me the space to present here today. Randy, your presentation was amazing. I've seen you present many times, but this one was really different, and I really would love to see the full length one. Also, Reed, thank you for sharing your research with me. It was really nice to get caught up on what you've been working on this last year. So diving right into it. So yeah, my name is Chelsea Dubiel. I am a recent graduate from the Biosystems Engineering program. I currently am an EIT with the NAPEG, the Northwest Territories and Nunavut Association of Engineers. I'm currently living on Chief Dragi's territory and on the traditional lands of the Yellowknives Dene and North Slave Métis. And I'm born and raised on Treaty 1 lands to settler and immigrant parents. So going into it, the project that Randy and Reed were both referring to, the Shoal Lake 40 design build. So my thesis is guiding touchstones, how can the engineering design process make space for Indigenous knowledges, principles, and values? So to get right into it, here's the project. It was a summer course, a design build course, where we built a shelter for community space and also to really reflect and represent all that the Freedom Road has to represent. And I'll be getting into what the Freedom Road is in my next slide. So as a student involved in this design build course and experiencing it firsthand, it really gave me an opportunity to explore the design process and basically how space can be made for Indigenous principles and values. I think the most important part of this research is positioning yourself and also understanding background and context. So in partnership with Shoal Lake 40 First Nation and the faculties of engineering, the transdisciplinary course was made. And so Shoal Lake 40 First Nation is a community about 2 hours east of Winnipeg. And it's actually where Winnipeg gets our drinking water from. So because of colonization and forced isolation due to a canal that was built, Shoal Lake 40 actually became on a man-made island. Therefore, there was no year-round access. So the community was only boat-in or dependent on unreliable ice roads since the construction of the aqueduct in 1919. So through progressive development and increasing boating activity, this actually resulted in their water being contaminated and the current water treatment plant being inadequate to actually treat the drinking water. Thus, the community has actually been on a boil water advisory since 1997, while Winnipeg continues to get their drinking water from Shoal Lake 40 some of the best water in the area. So of course, this resulted in the community taking action, holding many protests, and through discussions, finances became available from all levels of governance to complete Freedom Road. So Freedom Road is a mega transportation project that was completed in the summer of 2019, concurrently with the design build course. And it provides year-round access into Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. So this road is what made the construction of their new water treatment plant, their school, and this design build possible. So to tie it all together, due to this legacy of mistrust created from projects such as the Winnipeg Aqueduct, it's essential that we open up the engineering design process to Indigenous knowledges, values, and principles. So the approach and framework to the study and the project that happened over the last couple of years, through the exploration of experiences and perspectives of Shoal Lake 40 First Nation community members and university faculty, this study looks into how we can create space for the Indigenous principles, values, and knowledges. So to explore these experiences, guiding questions for open-ended interviews were developed based on participatory action research methods, personal insights, Indigenous evaluation methods, and also boundary crossing theories. And these guiding questions worked with a conceptual framework of two-eyed seeing, which Randy spoke to earlier. And so, like was said, two-eyed seeing is a guiding principle of learning how to see from both Indigenous and Western perspectives, and that together they benefit all. So having this work embody that guiding principle actively demonstrates the strength of creating space for both Indigenous and Western perspectives, and ultimately the transdisciplinary work that is seen within this design build course. So these were the findings, and really these findings are our lived experiences expressed as guiding touchstones external to the design process. So you can have any sort of design process centrally there. And so in conclusion, these guiding touchstones enable an engineer to perceive the design process, maintain core intentions. And in reality, this work is really one of reflection. And in developing the guiding touchstones, they organically flow into form. And now taking time away from it, I think it's really important for me to acknowledge how the medicine wheel teachings informed my findings, both consciously and unconsciously. And I think in this type of work, I think it's really important to understand what it means and feels like to truly appreciate and work towards two-eyed seeing, and what Eve Tech means when they say decolonization is not a metaphor. So in our current social climate, we need to learn how to best navigate our environments to create safer spaces for all. And I believe this is where Jill would take over. Thank you for listening, everyone. I think I might pass it back to Randy to close us off.
I think we might just skip ahead. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for both of you for excellent presentations. Randy, if it's okay with you, I think we might skip ahead to jumping to the dialogue rooms. And so Flint will now move everyone to the dialogue rooms. Please join me in thanking the speakers. As everyone filters back in, thank you so much for adding your thoughts and your design work to the narrative of what it is that we are doing and will continue to grow and do to decolonize and indigenize our engineering design work. For the facilitators, you are welcome to stay behind and debrief for the next 15 minutes. And for everyone, thank you so much for an extra 10 minutes of your evening. And to all the phenomenal speakers, thank you again. And Danilo for organizing everything.